Good evening, and thanks very much for joining us. My name is Denise Vigneault, and I want to welcome you to Howard Center's Myrna and Stephen Wise Tulin Spring Community Education Series. In case you're not familiar with our work, our mission at Howard Center is to help people and communities thrive by providing supports and services to address mental health, substance use, and developmental needs. To that end, our 1,600 wonderful staff support people across the age range, from the very young to our elders, in over 50 different programs. Sometimes it's for the short term through counseling or crisis and outreach services, and sometimes people are served for the longer term in one of our residential, employment, or community-based programs. While we are primarily in Chittenden County, we do have programs in a few other counties like Rutland and Franklin Grand Isle. Part of our work also includes educating our community about topics related to our mission. And tonight we will be talking about racial trauma and generational healing with Catarina Campbell, who I will introduce in just a moment. We want to thank our partner and friends at the University of Vermont Medical Center for their support for our education series. We also want to acknowledge and thank Hildra Colendress and Marcus Gunter, who will be signing for us tonight. Really appreciate your being with us. In terms of our format, during tonight's webinar, your audio, video, and chat functions will not be available. Immediately following Catarina's presentation, there will be time for comments and question and answers. They may be sent through, your questions and comments may be sent through the Q&A function on your toolbar at any time throughout the session, and you, of course, may also ask them anonymously. You should also be able to turn on your captions at the bottom of your toolbar and toggle your view at the top of your screen between speaker and gallery view based on your preference. We're also recording tonight's presentation, and it will be available on our website at howardcenter.org in the next few days. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Catarina Campbell, who's our organization's first director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Catarina brings their warmth and enthusiasm to our Howard Center community and comes to this role with a background in grassroots organizing, trauma-informed advocacy, and affinity-based programming at community centers in the United States and Brazil. Previously, Catarina served as the director of the SafeSpace Anti-Violence Program and the coordinator for programs and leadership at the Women and Gender Equity Center at the University of Vermont. They've also served on the boards of the Vermont ACLU and the Woven Collective. Honoring and celebrating our right to be embraced for all of who we are, Catarina strives to bring joyful and meaningful connection to their communities by tending to interpersonal connection as a conduit for social change. Please join me in giving Catarina a warm welcome. Catarina, I'm going to depart now, and I will be back right after your talk.
I'll see you on the other side, Denise.
Enjoy.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for co-creating this space. This is a really meaningful opportunity for me in that when I was invited to speak on this subject, I had to do a lot of fierce moral inventory and personal research to consider what I have to offer. And what I discerned is that ultimately I can speak from my own experience. And so that's what I will strive to do today. And thank you to all my mama is in the audience. So I just want to say thanks, Mom. Hi, she's tuning in from California. So thanks for always supporting me. And yeah, without further ado, I'd love to share some slides with you all. So I ask for grace if for some reason it doesn't load swiftly, but we'll do our best. All right. So we are going to be chatting today about racial trauma and generational healing. Again, my name is Catarina. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns, and I am getting to care for our community through the role of Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the Howard Center. So before we proceed, it's really important that we recognize where we are, those of us who are in the land and earth that we call Vermont, to recognize that we are on unceded Abenaki land, land of those in the Wabanaki Confederacy and connected tribes, that the Abenaki and connected people are not a relic of the past, but are very much present and have survived incredible, unspeakable things, including but not limited to the eugenics movement, which happened here in Vermont. So the invitation, the request is that we may honor that this land, if we are not Abenaki, is not ours. And may we act in solidarity and community and empowerment with those to whom this land righteously belongs. So thank you so much for that. In order to offer this conversation, it feels really important that we intentionally create our container. So in creating our container, I'm going to offer a saying that has been really important to me in this work. And I'd love to share with you where it comes from. So I first found this mantra, this prayer, this saying, when I was reading a book called Razor Wire Dharma, the cover of which is on the left here. And that book is written by Calvin Malone, who is a Black man who found Buddhism as a meaningful tool for peace and survival while he was incarcerated. And so it's his story about what it means to be physically incarcerated and to try to be mentally and spiritually liberated. And that was the first place I found this. Then I heard it from Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Buddhist practitioner and leader. And I wanted to use a picture of Thich Nhat Hanh in his relationship with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in that this very much demonstrates the inner relationship of liberation thinking with Black liberation specifically. And lastly, on the bottom right corner, we have Lama Rod Owens, who self-identifies as a gay Black Lama. And so through the convergence of all of these people, this has come to me. And I want to invite this to be definitely my intention and potentially the intention of each of us who has offered our time to be here tonight. So I'm going to read it twice. And the first time is just to orient folks. And the second time, if you wish, you are welcome to read it aloud with me or reflect as we offer it to the space. So my hope in holding this space is the following. May all beings be happy. May all beings be well. May all beings find peace. Again, may all beings be happy. May all beings be well. And may all beings find peace. It also feels really important as we recognize the land that we are on to also pay some attention to my vantage point in that I can only deliver what I know. And I do come from a very particular cultural context. For this time we have together, I'm going to be speaking a lot about Brazil and my Brazilian heritage. And Brazil is sometimes known as a racial democracy. There's a lot we can say there. Our conception of race and culture in Brazil is very connected, but also distinct from our United States context. And so what I offer here is a song that we call Canto das Três Raças. And Canto das Três Raças means the song of the three races. And it tells the story of racial development and freedom movements in Brazil. So I'm going to sing it for us, and then I will have an opportunity to share what we're communicating there. And I want to name that this song comes from a very, very important cultural figure in Brazilian culture, Clara Nunes. And you can see her photo on either side. And so this is a song from her. And I apologize in advance if the audio gets squeaky. We're just going to do the best we can. Ninguém ouviu soluçar de dor no canto do Brasil. Lamento triste sempre ecoou. Deste o índio guerreiro foi pro cativeiro e de lá cantou. Negro, Canto de revolta pelos sais, no quilombo dos palmares, onde se refugiou. Fora a luta dos inconfidentes, pela quebra das correntes, nada adiantou. E de guerra em paz e paz em guerra, todo o povo dessa terra, quando pôde cantar, cantar de dor. So that is our song of the three races. And an English translation, I won't go line for line, but we'll tell the story of the song, is no one ever heard a sob of pain quite like the song of Brazil. And it tells the story of how that song of pain started when the first Indigenous warrior was captured and held captive. And that person's cry echoed so much and so loudly that the African laborers who were forced and enslaved to the shores of Brazil heard it. They heard the Indigenous cry, and that it was that community, the Black community, the Afro-Brazilian community, that turned the Indigenous cry into a song of revolution. It also shares that in our composition of racial relationships, dynamics, indigeneity, slavery, etc., that we are constantly in war with peace and in peace with war, and that the people of Brazil, of our land, when we sing together, but we sing a song of pain. So who are we? we from Brazil, and me in particular. This map is a map of my lineage. And what I really love about it is that you can trace the history of Brazil through the movement of my ancestry. In the upper corner, you can see Portugal and Spain and those of the Mediterranean who colonized Brazil. You can see the areas of what is known as Yoruba land, Nigeria, West Benin, etc., where people were captured and forced into enslavement and brought to Brazil. And on the lower left, there's a green area that has some dotted lines around it. And that is the area, that's the land where I was born, and is also the land of my indigenous tribe, which is the Kaigangi people of Southeast Brazil. So looking at this is just one person, one Brazilian, and you can see the diversity, literal, geographic, ethnic, cultural, linguistic diversity that makes our people possible. And when written about, we are, particularly indigenous people from Southern Brazil, are described as a new cultural entity, meaning that we are neither Mediterranean, nor Aboriginal Indian, nor African, that we are something that is a combination of all of these forces that is, quote unquote, that new cultural entity. So the lineage of our survival is creating a different blend of identity, culture, and race. So I would love to bring it to my lineage. How does this show up here? So I am going to start with my origin story. In this presentation, I'm focusing on the roots of my Brazilian ancestry. And also, as I do that and talk about the woman in the picture here, I also want to honor and name that I am a person who comes from multiple mothers. I have my birth mother, Edna, who is pictured here, who we're going to talk about in a little more detail. And I also have who I refer to as my soul mother, the woman who raised me and adopted me, Ann Wells. And we were joking that we could do a whole talk on how she and I have been trying to break generational trauma, but we'll save that for another presentation. In the meantime, I just say thank you. So Edna Cristina Moraes Cabral, in the picture on the left, is my birth mother. And she is indigenous. She is from the land where my tribe is, the Kaigangi people. And at the time that Edna was alive, it was unfortunately common practice for wealthy Brazilians to adopt indigenous children and raise them in indentured servitude. And this unfortunately happened to Edna, to my birth mother. So she was the victim of something that is called false adoption. And she was adopted into indentured servitude as an infant. With indentured servitude come things like not domestic violence, sexual violence, all forms of exploitation. And at 11 years old, Edna decided that she would rather live on the streets than continue to be indentured. And so she ran away at age 11, got pregnant with the child in her arms there, my half sister Kari, at age 13, and then at age 15 became pregnant with me. And when I was born and her boyfriend at the time saw how dark my skin was, she was kicked out of the house. So in the time that she was pregnant with me, she was living under a bridge. I should also mention that because she had been an indentured servant, Edna was not literate. She could neither read nor write in Portuguese. So Edna was faced with a dilemma. She herself had been falsely adopted and indentured. And she also knew that she couldn't take care of another child living on the streets. And so Edna made a promise to herself that I would be adopted to a North American family that highly valued education. And there's a whole lot to say about my adoption story, but it was complicated. It was supposed to take 2 weeks. It took 4 months. There were couples who wanted to adopt me for indentured servitude. And Edna is recorded as saying that either I go to my family, my North American family, or the adoption folks would be sentencing another child to a life on the streets. That it was their choice, but I was either going to be with her on the streets of Brazil or be with this North American family. And the family I was adopted into fulfilled Edna's wishes. My mother was the vice chancellor of a university. My father, my grandfather, the president. My grandmother was the head of the psychiatry counseling department. And I have been heartily encouraged academically. I speak Portuguese and write in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. So I love this story because the woman who changed at my inception the course of my life is someone who we maybe think wouldn't have a lot of power. She was 15. She was living under a bridge. She was illiterate. And yet her decision to change her relationship as an Indigenous person to indentured servitude and trauma changed my life. And she did break that pattern. On the right is a picture of members of my tribe. And we very much exist. We are still real. It is estimated that there are about 45,000 of us left. And the person on the furthest right has a headdress that says livre, and livre means free. So now we're going to talk a little bit less about me and more about Brazilian culture. So when thinking about how to share examples of what generational healing looks like, there are an abundance of them, and I chose to focus on these 3. So the perhaps most delicious one is in the left corner, and that is a picture of the national dish of Brazil, which is called feijoada. And feijoada has been elevated to the national dish and has its roots in Afro-Brazilian culture and resistance. And the story of feijoada is that during chattel slavery, Afro-Brazilians were given the ends of things, the tail, the hoof, the fatty parts, and needed to make something with that, and also needed food that would support the intense labor that they were being subjected to. And so what do? You throw the fatty meat in with some black beans, which are really nourishing and hearty. You put some vegetables and you eat it with rice. And it is delicious. I made some yesterday and I'm very excited to eat it. I won't get too distracted by being hungry, but it's a beautiful example of how something can start from a need to survive and also become a delicacy. In the middle, we have a picture of capoeira. And capoeira, there's so much I can say about capoeira. Some people, it has been jokingly referred to as sexy Brazilian fight dancing, but it is much deeper than that. Capoeira was created by Afro-Brazilian people, and it is a physical exercise that looks and moves like a dance, but is also a martial art. And unlike some martial arts, in capoeira, your goal is not necessarily to strike. If you're doing it well, you're going to have a lot of near misses, but you're actually not going to really hurt each other. The kicks are strong and powerful, so sometimes it happens, but your goal is to intuit each other's movements and be able to train together. And in capoeira, what the hope is that we train together to get free. Capoeira, the first movement in capoeira is you put your hands up and sway side to side with the person who is your partner in the exercise in the circle, which we call the roda. You can see in this image the circle of people surrounding these two folks in the middle. There are Afro-Brazilian instruments and there's singing. And so once you enter the roda, the circle with someone, you put your palms up and sway side to side. And the oral tradition history is that we do that because the people who created capoeira were in bondage. And so literally we're bound from wrist to wrist and could only move like this. So that is how we open our rodas. During chattel slavery in Brazil, capoeira was able to go under the radar for a little while because the Portuguese thought that the Afro-Brazilian folks were dancing. They didn't realize that they were training to get free until slavery was abolished in Brazil and capoeira became outlawed, illegal, because the fear was that if Afro-Brazilians got together, they would start a riot, a liberation movement. Capoeira is no longer illegal. We've managed to keep the practice alive and continue building, but it was illegal for some time because what we created was dangerous in so much that it could start a revolution, and thankfully it did. So the next picture is a picture of an altar space in Brazil, and I felt moved to include this for a variety of reasons. When I was reading about my tribe, one of the things I read from one of our shamans that was really moving to me was translated: we have always had our shamans, we have always had our own God. Before colonization, we knew how to take care of ourselves, and we had a healing tradition that we still keep alive. And so part of colonization and slavery is that communities have their religion, their spirituality, their gods, their deities stripped, outlawed, taken away. And Brazilians practice something that we call syncretism, which is when you are able to blend religions and practices, but keep the spirit of the original practice alive. So if we look at this altar, you'll see that it's very colorful. You'll see some people who look like the Virgin Mary, some saints looking folks, and then you'll see some other figures that maybe are a little different, that are darker skinned, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a beautiful representation of the blend that is now happening in Brazilian religions. For syncretism, what happened when Afro-Brazilians in particular were not able to practice our traditions or honor our gods is we made a kind of equivalent system. So when Afro-Brazilians prayed to, say, the Virgin Mary, statues of the Virgin Mary was said to represent one of our deities, our archetypes, also known as orixás, Iemanjá, who is the spirit of the sea, of motherly love, of care, of compassion. So Brazilians would pray to the Virgin Mary, but in their hearts believe that they were also praying to Iemanjá. And so that kind of creative, adaptive practice enabled Brazilians to keep our tradition and our lineage, our gods alive, and has now blossomed into a variety of religions and spiritualities in Brazil that we can geek out about later, including candomblé and espiritismo. So bringing it back to this moment, in having the opportunity to reflect on what we could share together and what I could potentially share with you all, I've had to do a lot of reflection about what it means to be a modern day person from my tribe. And each of these photos captures an element of what that means to me. So on the left, the black and white photo of people walking with spheres in the air is called Kaigangi contra os colonos. And that means Kaigangi against the colonizer. My tribe is known for never fully surrendering or believing what the Portuguese shared in terms of their desire to have us not practice our religion, et cetera, et cetera. We were one of the first 5 tribes to write a letter in Portuguese to the Portuguese demanding our freedom in our land. And this picture came after there was an attempt to build a factory on Kaigangi land, and our people took over the factory and threatened to burn it all down if the folks who tried to build the factory didn't leave. And after a long occupation, they left. And so this is the photo of the Kaigangi people walking back victorious from that movement. On the right, in the image that is in color, you can see a being with a circle on their cheek and a headdress. And that is one of our modern pujas. And puja is the word that we use for our shamans. And so this picture really demonstrates that our people have managed to keep our healing traditions alive, have managed to continue the education and respect of those who we identify as our healers, and that we're actively practicing our own medicine. And on the bottom is a picture of me with my friend Bruno the last time I was in Brazil. The last time I was in Brazil, I worked with an organization called Educafro, which works to offer scholarships, full scholarships to what we say in Portuguese are pretos, pardos y pobres. And that means Afro-Brazilians, brown Brazilians, and poor, impoverished Brazilians. And so I was there and we had demonstrations at the Capitol, and this is a photo from one of those demonstrations. And to me, it really shows with Bruno and I that we are the current embodiment and iteration of our people. And I'm still trying to learn what it means to be a member of my tribe, what it means to be a modern version of who we've been. And when I think about that, there is a phrase that I turn to, and that's the phrase that you see on the top of the screen. This saying is not from my tribe, it's from the Guarani people, who are our neighbors. And the saying is, amor é preciso, viver não é preciso. And what that means is loving is necessary. Loving is necessary. Living is not necessary. And this is we call it a guerreira statement, a warrior statement. And so as Indigenous people, the Guarani, are mobilizing, what is most important for them is that they act in love. Even more important than living and breathing is always centering and acting in love. And so that is an inheritance that I receive and that I take and that I will strive to embody for the rest of my life. So in closing, I want to offer us a collective prayer. No pressure to participate in this, but please feel welcome to be in this space as I share. And then we're also going to invite folks to engage in an embodiment somatic closing, and I will guide us through that. And I'm also going to do it with you. So the quote that I want to offer to us comes from Jana Ling Umipig and reads as follows. I will say that I accessed this poem, this quote, from Decolonizing Therapy on their social media. So check them out. The poem is, I don't come from nowhere. I have roots. I have ancestors. I am part of a lineage that survived. I do not rise alone. This body carries many. I do not come from loss, erasure. I am not empty and without. I am alive and I am full of my ancestors. And so, as we imagine what that means, what it means to honor where we come from, that we do not come from places of loss and erasure, that we are incredibly and undeniably connected to our ancestors, I want to invite us in this moment to be part of what we call embodied healing. There is so much to say about Reshma Menachem is a wonderful writer, social worker, etc., who talks about something called somatic abolitionism. And we can chat more about that perhaps in the discussion, but the idea of it is that the oppression of things like slavery, colonization, indentured servitude, etc., that those things live in our bodies and live in our bones and are translated across generations just to as freedom, as capoeira, as feijoada, as candomblé are passed down. So the examples that we looked at from Brazilian culture, feijoada, the food we eat, is passed down through generations. Capoeira, the way we move, the way we dance, is passed down through generations. Syncretismo, syncretism, the way we have our spiritualities survive, is passed down through generations. So the idea is that when we heal ourselves in our bodies as much as we can in this moment, we are healing our DNA, we are healing generations of experience and trauma. So I believe, I was talking to Denise, who introduced me today, actually, about how we can create change for things that are so big, wanting to end the harm of racism, of transphobia, of et cetera, et cetera. And I believe that there is something really sacred that happens on the interpersonal level, and something really freeing and loving we can do in allowing ourselves to feel freer and more loved in our own bodies. So all that to say, I'm going to invite us to do an exercise together. If being in your body is not something that feels safe or good to you right now, that's totally okay. And please feel welcome to take care of yourself, take a turn, put the presentation on mute for a minute, and just participate to the degree that it feels good to you. You're also welcome to be a witness. So this practice, I'm going to do it with you in real time, starts with us inviting ourselves to explore the opportunity to get just even a little bit more comfortable. And also offering love and acceptance to parts of us that don't feel comfortable right now or do hold tension, and honoring that maybe they are constricted, are holding us in a certain way for a reason. So we offer tenderness to the parts of us that are maybe a little tense or uncomfortable. And we also explore what is something we can do to get a little more grounded in our seat. For me, I'm going to lean back a little bit. I'm going to put my chest forward, recenter my center of gravity in the middle of my body, and just kind of take a big, perhaps audible exhale. And now I'm going to invite us to witness what we experience in our body when we invite some things that are what we're trying to build together in the movement for love and freedom. And we'll start by seeing what happens to our body when we invite the word freedom. So when we think of freedom, what happens in our bodies? For me, my back gets a little straighter. I feel my shoulders go down, and I do feel my chest kind of puff out a little bit. So I invite us to notice, does anything change for you? And secondly, we're going to invite the word peace. To notice what happens in our bodies as we consider the energy of peace. And we send this energy of peace and of freedom to ourselves through our bones, down to every ancestor, past and future. So all of us may be happy, so all of us may be well, and so all of us may find peace. And now we're going to have some discussion and some questions. I can promise no answers. I wish I could, but I can't, because this is bigger than me. So I will respond as earnestly as I can to everything that's brought forward. And I really hope that we're able to continue this discussion. The last thing I will say before we switch to Q&A is that I would love to be in connection with anyone who wants to collaborate in this work. And by this work, I mean creating belonging and deeper freedom and healing in our communities. You're welcome to email me, catarinac@howardcenter.com. Is that it? .org. And I hope that this is not the end of this conversation. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Catarina, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. And we do, so now we are at the point where folks can write in the Q&A down on the bottom of your toolbar, and a few people have already done that, but please keep your questions and your comments coming. Catarina,
what cat has been good.
Say again?
My cat has behaved himself this whole time.
That's so great.
I didn't think he would, but he's sleeping next to me. So that's already a win.
Yay. So Catarina, I'm going to just pose questions and comments to you. That's okay. And the first is a very big thank you for sharing your story. Someone is asking, what aspects of your history and heritage do you feel most influence you in your life today, both in positive and maybe more challenging ways?
I love that. Thank you. I'm learning so much about myself through this process. So it's a really meaningful thing to have the opportunity to reflect on that. What's coming up for me, I think the hardest thing is that there are so few of us, that my tribe is an endangered people. And I feel a huge responsibility to continue our survival and to bring us into the modern day, because we are still here. And I am, whether I like it or not, I do like it, but I am one of the people who survived. And so that's a big responsibility. And sometimes that gets overwhelming. And in terms of the positive, it's kind of a flip side of the same coin. I come from people who, when I get overwhelmed in this work meaning the work to address harms of bigotry, violence, etc., it's overwhelming. And then I think about the fact that I come from people who have lived through some of the most unspeakable things. My Afro-Brazilian ancestors who were in bondage, my mother who was an indentured servant, et cetera, et cetera. We have already lived through the worst. And if needed to, we will live through the worst again, but we will continue doing what the Guarani say, which is to center love. And so that always brings me to a place that gives me a lot of hope and gratitude. And thank you so much for the question.
Catarina, in terms of it, as you were going through the slide deck, the spirituality of you and your people really came forth. Can you talk a little bit about that? Has that helped your people and you to get through these difficult times?
That is not a full answer. Is not a full answer, but I have that. The short answer is yes. I think I'll speak from the indigeneity perspective on this one in particular. So part of colonization that we've seen across both in North America and in Brazil, some similarities are that when people came in Brazil, it was Mediterranean folks, largely Portuguese. One of the first things that they did was they were trying to save the indigenous souls, save the heathen indigenous people. And how do you do that? You convert them to Christianity. The first thing you do is you take away their God and you take away their language. And that is really disorienting and harmful. In the United States, until 1978, with the passing of the what was it, the Indigenous, I think it's the Indian Freedom Act of 1978. Indigenous people in North America were not allowed to sing, to share stories, to share oral history, or to write history. So the fact that we have been able to keep our cosmology, it just blows my mind. And I think what I'll share is that in doing this presentation, I have bought a lot of books and have read a lot about my tribe. And this one came, it's called The Star of the Kaigangi. And it's a children's book that talks about our creation story. And I'm very excited because I plan to connect with youth from my tribe and potentially to parent an Indigenous child. And I want to have them have access to the stories that were outlawed, that were silenced. And having a place to relate in that way it's like having your compass. And so even with colonization and being forced to convert to other religions, Afro-Brazilian and Indigenous people have managed to keep our spiritual compass.
Thank you. Several other thank yous in the comments. One of the, someone is asking, do you know, after they said that was amazing, do you know of local or virtual spaces for others to share their story as a way of healing and sharing?
Ooh. Yes, I think it depends on kind of what community someone is looking for and what they're looking to share. There are so many ways to connect. I know for me, I have used things like Facebook groups. I've typed in the name of my tribe. I've met I've gone to Brazilian gatherings where I can be and socialize with other Brazilians. I think wanting to tell your story is a deeply brave and courageous thing. And one of the ways of doing that has been most empowering for me is spoken word. And so going to venues where we can write our story, especially as an Indigenous person for whom expression was outlawed for many years, something about creating and sharing art feels really beautiful. I also want to give a shout out to the Howard Center Arts Collective, which is a group of folks who come together and create art in a variety of beautiful ways. And so there's no wrong way to do it, but for me, sharing through art has been the most impactful community.
So beautiful. And yes, the Arts Collective is just incredible. Another question, what advice do you have for clinicians who are working with those who have experienced racial trauma?
Yes, okay, I'm so grateful for that. What advice do I have for clinicians who are working with folks who have experienced racial trauma? So I'm just going to honor what comes up for me first. I think there are two things. One is that through my vantage point, through my understanding of history, we have all experienced racial trauma. That whether my ancestors, I have Portuguese ancestry, I have Spanish ancestry, I have French ancestry, I have Irish ancestry. And those are folks, not entirely, but Portuguese and Spanish, they colonized the people that I come from. I have part of my lineage, the Portuguese, that colonized part of my lineage, Afro-Brazilian and Indigenous Brazilian. And there is something inherently traumatizing about participating in trauma. Whether you are the one who is receiving the trauma or you're the one who is creating the trauma, participating in harm and violence is harmful to all of us. So I want to demystify this idea that racial trauma that slavery and colonization was only traumatic for Black and Brown people. It also has left an incredible spiritual scar for people who enslaved folks, for people who colonized. And so I think that is a frame that comes. I think if we want to support each other, around trauma, we have to face our own trauma. Reshma Menachem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, is a really gorgeous guide for how we can do that. And I think when I feel safest around practitioners, as a person who comes from my backgrounds, having someone recognize that there is a historical trauma in the room with us, I think particularly as an Indigenous person, we were, particularly with shamanism, people who display some of the traits of shamanism, which include things like talking to ancestors, connecting with trees, having visions, dreaming into reality. Those things are sometimes misunderstood clinically and are thought of as, so a lot of our shamans, a lot of our Indigenous people, a lot of our healers have been pathologized, have been labeled as insane or not valuable. And so I think having openness to a cultural context that maybe we're not aware of is helpful before we diagnose, before we pathologize. And then lastly, because this is such a beautiful question, doing our own work. We cannot, there's this idea that we can only meet people as far as we've met ourselves. And so if we want to meet someone compassionately with histories of racial trauma, we have to reckon with our own relationship to those things.
Thank you. I want to read just a couple of comments. Thank you for such beautiful story talking, Catarina. Take that in. Thank you. We are so happy that we were able to join you. We love you. We are one. We'll see you soon. Some other friends wrote in. Let's see.
Another my mama, I'm sure.
No, that was not your mama, but I think I see mama here. Let me see. Mama says, thank you, Catarina. What a beautiful shining light you are. Love you to the moon and back. So nice.
Thanks, Mom.
Okay. On a more serious note, one attendee wonders about the indentured servitude that you talked about, and wonders whether it's still happening today.
I wish I could say no. I would love to say no, but I can't. I don't know how prevalent it is. I don't know if things, in the area that I'm from, if they have been healed more, but I do know that indentured servitude is still something that happens in communities across the world. And my birth mother is an example. And I hope that I really value the question because it invites us to think about what's happening in real time and to respond to it. I know that as someone who comes from ancestors who both were impacted by chattel slavery and by indentured servitude, I have less of an opportunity to talk about indentured servitude sometimes. I don't think that we have as many conversations about that. And so the question that this person is asking is really impacting me in a positive way, because I don't experience people caring about it that much, not because it's not important, but just because we don't talk about it very often.
Thank you. Another attendee is wondering about your other siblings.
Yeah. So I have both a lot of siblings and not a lot of siblings at the same time. I was effectively raised as an only child in my adopted family, but there is my half sister who was in the picture who stayed with our birth mother. I have tried to find her. I've gone back to Brazil twice now looking for my family of origin and wasn't able to find her. So I don't know how she's doing. And I think about a lot that because of the resources that I have been given, am a version of what both my half sister and my mother could have been if they had had access to nourishment, shelter, and education. And I don't know if she's here, but my Brazilian sister, whose family supported us in our adoption, her name is Stefania. I call her Tuca. She was planning to tune in tonight. And so I was raised with her and her brother Marcos, who came as exchange students with our family and have known me since I was an infant. So that's a sister. I have a sister named Charlie who was adopted into our family later. I have infinite chosen sisters and siblings. And so I'm a bit of a contradiction in that I'm an only child with all these chosen folks.
It's wonderful. It's the web you've woven of family.
Yeah. Yeah. And as an adopted person and a displaced person, family can be hard. So building a family feels really important.
Thank you. A couple more questions. What can generational healing from racial trauma look like in a US context, particularly for communities that are very removed from their historical and cultural roots due to oppression?
Mm. I mean, I have a guttural response to that. And
We don't expect you to have an answer for everything, but maybe a comment.
I'm down to talk about it. That's why I do this work, because I don't know if I said this in the presentation, but my goal is to end the cycle of trauma in my lineage. That's what I'm wanting to do here. And I wish that for all of us, genuinely. So the question was, what does generational healing look like in a US context? And what about for people who are displaced or disconnected from
their history and cultural roots?
Yeah. So I think in a US context, there are so many people who embody generational healing. When I think about the folks who have shaped my life in that regard, I think about people like Rejma Menachem. I think about people like Lamarad Owens. I think about people like Alok Vaid-Menon, who is a Desi American trans activist who speaks a lot about what they are healing in their lineage in relationship to being someone who was raised in Texas, but coming from a family with origins in India, etc. Susu Heals is an organization here of people from what we call the diaspora, and the diaspora referring to all the different African tribes and nations that were impacted by chattel slavery and then migrated throughout the world. They teach people from the diaspora ancestral healing and herbalism. There's conscious homestead. I guess I'm naming all of this in that we have people we can look to in real time who are embodying this healing. There's something called the NAP Ministry, which is by Trisha, someone in the audience, maybe we can put it in the chat. Last name starts with an H, who is a person who talks about racial healing and rest. So I think realizing that liberation is happening in real time right now, that as people who come from the histories that we come from, as people who have survived, we are actively creating a future where we are more and more free, more and more well. And so looking to the people who are doing that and joining, knowing that we have agency to join in. And in terms of the question about what happens when we are fragmented, we get to mourn that. We get to mourn that. When I was invited to offer this space, I cried in the middle of my floor because I thought, there are 45,000 of my people. How do I speak about us when our language has been taken, when our stories have been taken? And I've been researching my people all my life, but we were taken from our communities. We were separated from our traditions, from our families, from our languages. In the US context, we have things like the tribal boarding schools, for instance, where Indigenous children were taken from their families, were not allowed contact with mothers, grandmothers I think they were in the boarding schools for 8 months out of the year. So in terms of what we do about being disconnected, I encourage the person who I'm connected to through this question to let ourselves mourn that. And the last thing I'll share is that there are opportunities to reconnect. I very strongly believe that our ancestors are with us. And sometimes we reconnect through song. I know that I heard samba, and something about it felt intuitive to me before I even knew what it was. And in terms of plant medicine, I was in a class once where they said to use plants from our lineage. And I was so undone by that because I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know my lineage. I can't find anything. And Naomi, who runs Susu, said, choose the most familiar thing and research it. So I chose to use something called Palo Santo, which is a sacred wood that is used in Latin America. And when I researched Palo Santo, I learned that the Palo Santo tree is the cousin of something called Bru Claro, which is the tree that my tribe uses for ceremony. So I started over here and found my way there. And so I say, lean into what feels good to you. Lean into what feels good to you and mourn what we've lost, because we have that right.
Amazing, thank you. I want to read just a couple comments and then maybe time for one more question. So, and this is just an ask for you to read your email a little bit more slowly, and maybe someone on my team could also type it into the chat.
Yeah, delighted to. So my email is my name, which is spelled Catarina, C. So it's Catarina C at howardcenter.org.
Great, thank you. And then this is not a question, but someone wanted to say thank you so much for providing captions and an interpreter. I also appreciated that you described the images. It felt like a presentation almost any English speaker could understand. Bravo.
We try, thank you. And feel free to call us to that, especially within DEI, it's so deeply important that we be accessible. And so please feel free to keep our team on task with that. And thank you for that reflection.
And let's see. Question. Thanks for being vulnerable and sharing your story. Do you know, and if so, what efforts being put forth to confront colorism in Brazil?
Oh, I love that question. So when I literally wrote a Fulbright proposal on this. So I'm going to try not to geek out to everyone in the last 3 minutes, but the short answer is let's talk about it. Come find me. Please send me an email. The longer answer is the organization that I worked with called Educafro. There's so much that came up in that work. And the reason they have pretos, pardos, y pobres, Afro-Brazilian, dark brown-skinned Brazilian, and poor Brazilians is that we're all a big mix. Many of us are such a mixture of things, and colorism is real. And colorism shows up in Brazil. It shows up in some deeply painful, violent, hard ways. And the revolutionaries that I know there are trying to both, similar to what we're doing in the United States, to help us be conscious of colorism while also building a connected movement. So how do we have Indigenous people working with Afro-Brazilian people, knowing that Indigenous people experience colorism very differently to the violence that darker-skinned Afro-descendant people are living in Brazil? And so I think being able to say we don't experience, or what I saw in Brazil at least, was people saying, yes, dark-skinned Brazilian people, particularly Afro-Brazilian people, have an experience that is unique, that is sacred, that is violent in different ways, and centering that narrative. So to answer the question, Educafro, which is the organization I work with, really strives to do that. And I think even in Indigenous movements, there is a desire to be conscious of the connected struggle that we have and the uniqueness of our racial experiences.
Thanks, Catarina. Another comment, thank you so much for this great webinar. I'm a Black Italian with West African roots. I'm grateful that I was able to participate in this safe space. Thank you very much. And then just a last question that I think will be quick. How many Braziliana indigenous tribes are there? Do you know?
Oh, that's such a good question. I looked it up online once, but I don't know by memory. I do know that the Kaigangi people were one of the larger tribes with 45,000. But it's intense. There's a thing in Brazil where as long as there are indigenous people on the land is indigenous land. And when there are not indigenous people on the land is up for consideration. And so a lot of tribes, particularly those that have smaller numbers, are really struggling because if their numbers disappear, if they dwindle, they lose their ancestral land. So that is something that is happening in Brazil right now. And I love the question. I don't have it on the top of my brain, but I think what I'll say is that there are many of us in our way, and we exist and we're still here.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. This was really, really wonderful. And thanks to all of our attendees for the questions. It is really time now to close. Let me just take a look at a couple of things that we need to do. There's information about our services and resources on the screen with our contact information. howardcenter.org is our website, and you can always find information there. Hilda and Marcus, thank you very much for making our event more accessible tonight. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all of our viewers who tuned in. Catarina, we can't thank you enough. Really, really appreciate your time and energy and preparation and everything you went through to make it to here this evening. Let's see, as a nonprofit, we depend on fundraising to support our services to people in our community. As it turns out, we are in the midst of our spring appeal right now with a focus on youth mental health. If you're able and interested, contributions are always gratefully accepted at howardcenter.org. And then lastly, we'd be grateful if you could take a few minutes to complete the evaluation form. There's a link in the chat, and then we'll be sending you an email. So this concludes our spring community education series. Always so appreciative that folks come out for it. Thank you for joining us. Be well. Good night.